کهکشان مقاومت ایران 1403 سومین روز اجلاس کهکشان مقاومت ایران در پاریس. ایران، جنایت علیه بشریت و محاکمه آمران و عاملان 11 تیر 1403 سخنرانی شخصیتهای سیاسی و حقوقی، وکلا و قضات، کارشناسان ویژه ملل متحد و قانونگذاران از کشورهای مختلف جهان.
سخنرانیهای پروفسور درشوویتز، استاد افتخاری دانشگاه حقوق هاروارد، زوریکا ماریچ، معاون پیشین وزیر خارجه مونته، سفیر مونته در شورای حقوق بشر 2015، استانیسلاو پاولوفشی، وزیر دادگستری مولداوی 2019، قاضی دادگاه حقوق بشر اروپا 2001 تا 2008، ژنرال چاکوالد، جانشین فرمانده نیروهای آمریکا در اروپا 2006.
Our next speaker is a renowned human rights lawyer and an esteemed professor of law. His contributions to legal thought and his passionate advocacy for justice have really made an impact around the world. Please do join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mr. Dershowitz. Sir, the floor is yours.
پروفسور درشوویتز، استاد افتخاری دانشگاه حقوق هاروارد. برنامه 10 ماده‌ای، یک برنامه شگفت‌انگیز برای دموکراسی واقعی و نوری نه تنها برای منطقه بلکه برای جهان است.
It's a great honor to speak before such a distinguished audience of people seeking such a distinguished and great result, justice. I want to dedicate this speech, this talk, to my dear friend Joe Lieberman, who many of you know. Joe and I were working together on a human rights op-ed for the Wall Street Journal just hours before he fell and then subsequently died. It was one of the great tragedies of modern times. Joe could have lived a great and productive life, but tragically, he was taken away from us. Joe, I can tell you, would be so thrilled to be here today, particularly in light of the 10-point plan. I'm not going to read it to you, but I'm going to say to you, this is one of the best human rights documents I have ever been privileged to read. It combines all the best elements of the American Bill of Rights, the Canadian Bill of Rights, the unwritten Constitution in Great Britain, constitutions all through Europe, South America. If the people of Iran were able to live under these 10 points, they would be so grateful. I can't imagine anybody, an ordinary citizen of Iran who would not accept these 10 points and would not want to live under them. It's just an amazing agenda for real democracy and a light not only unto the region, but unto the world. What we are urging and what these 10 points urge is not a return to the tyrannies of the past, whether the distant past or the recent past. What we want is a future. The past was filled with a long litany of crimes against humanity, crimes against the Iranian people, crimes against women, crimes against dissidents, crimes against children, crimes against people of every possible background. And that has to come to an end, and it has to come to an end now. And these programs that is put forward in this 10-point program is a roadmap. It's a roadmap for the future of a free Iran. The status quo is unacceptable. It's extremely dangerous to the world. It's extremely dangerous to the people of Iran. We need change, and we need it now. There are two options. One option is reform. The other option is regime change. Let me tell you a story about what happened in the middle 1930s. As you know, the Nazis came to power, and the British and the French considered what to do when the Nazis violated the Versailles Treaty. And this is what Goebbels, the head of propaganda for the Nazis, wrote in his diary. He said, in 1933, a French premier ought to have said, and if I had been the French premier, I would have said, the new Reich Chancellor, Hitler, is the man who wrote Mein Kampf, says this and that. The man cannot be tolerated in our vicinity. Either he disappears or we march. But they didn't do it. They left us alone and let us sift through the dangerous zone, and we were able to go around all the dangerous reefs. I hope and pray that someday a mullah will not write that in his diary, saying there was an opportunity for outside forces, for international courts, for the United States, for others, to bring about regime change because the current regime is intolerable. But they didn't do it. And look at the result. And none of us can predict the result. We talked about the difficulty of predicting what happened when the wall came down. Imagine how much more difficult it is to predict whether or not Iran would use a nuclear arsenal against any countries in the region or against even countries outside the region. It's impossible to predict that. And so there must be regime change. There must be, not only for the sake, primarily for the sake of the Iranian people, but for the sake of the region, for the sake of world peace, for the sake of basic decency. The world cannot tolerate in 2024 the mullahs of Iran any more than the world should have tolerated in 1933, 34, and 35, the Nazis of Germany. Had the Nazi regime been defeated in 1935, there wouldn't have been 50 million deaths, but nobody would have known it at the time. And the people who brought about regime change would have been called war criminals or warmongers, because history is blind to the future. Now, one of our speakers talked about international courts. I really do think that a case should be opened by the International Criminal Court against the mullahs of Iran, naming specifically people who were involved in decisions to commit genocide, to commit war crimes, to commit acts of aggression against other countries. Our government, the United States government, is appeasing Iran. It is not implementing the sanctions. It is not putting pressure on Iran, either domestically or internationally. And so it's so important to up the pressure, legally, economically, politically, diplomatically. But Iran, the idea that it has to spread, it's terrorism. It is the greatest exporter of terrorism in modern times. So unless things change, unless we absolutely devote ourselves to ending this horrible regime and bringing real democracy, the 10-point program democracy to the people of Iran, things will get worse. We cannot allow that to happen. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, moving on to our next speaker in today's gathering. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Ambassador Zorica Marek-Djordjevic, the esteemed former ambassador of Montenegro to the UN Human Rights Council and the World Trade Organization. She is a dedicated human rights advocate.
زوریکا ماریچ، معاون پیشین وزیر خارجه مونته نگرو. مردم ایران از رژیم سرکوبگر تروریستی فراتر رفتند. آنها برای آزادی و نه برای عوض کردن یک دیکتاتور با دیگری آماده اند. آنها برای دموکراسی و برابری شعار می دهند، نه برای بازگشت سلطنت ظالمانه. شورای ملی مقاومت ایران، نماینده آرزوهای واقعی مردم ایران، برای یک ایران مبتنی بر جدایی دین و دولت، دموکراتیک و کثرت‌گراست. برنامه 10 ماده‌ای خانم مریم رجوی چشماندازی تحول آفرین برای ایران ارائه می‌دهد. این برنامه بیانیه مهمی از حقوق بشر در قرن 21 را نمایندگی می‌کند. بیانیه‌ای که همه ما می‌توانیم امروز آن را امضا کنیم.
Madam Rajavi, dear friends and colleagues, my dear Iranian sisters, dear relatives and survivors of political prisoners, and those who tragically vanished in the massacre in 1988, families and friends of those tortured and killed in the last 45 years by the hands of brutal criminal regime in Tehran, I want to extend the warmest greetings to all of you, especially those following the conference back home in Iran, and those brave women and men at Ashraf Tree in Albania. Merdad, my dear friends. Distinguished participants and colleagues, I am honored and humbled to be here with you again for the World Summit Free Iran 2024. As a daughter of political prisoner, I bonded with all of you last year through the shared experience of our families. But dear sisters and brothers, dear friends in Iran, political prisoners, you are not alone, and we hear you loudly and clearly here in Paris. And we take seriously your resistance and message that Iran is at a crossroads. We stand with you. The passing of Ibrahim Raisi and the subsequent sham elections have deepened and opened wide existing fractures within Iran's regime. The lowest turnout in the history of Iran's elections demonstrates not only the apparent boycott of the electorate, but sends a powerful message to the whole world. Iranian people have gone beyond the terrorist oppressive regime. They are ready and prepared for freedom, not just the change of dictators. Dear friends, Iranians have no memory of any form of government other than a monarchy of the House of Pahlavi or the Islamic Republic established by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. I strongly believe that the National Council of Resistance of Iran can bridge this gap, democratically empowering the people and guaranteeing that ethnic religious groups and protected and celebrated for their diversity, dynamism, and humanity is on our reach. This coalition represents the genuine aspiration of the Iranian people for secular, democratic, and pluralistic Iran. Madam Maryam Rajavi's 10 points offers a transformative vision for Iran, addressing the oppressive, violent history of the mullahs regime over the last 45 years, and represent an important declaration of human rights in 21st century, one that we can all sign today. And make no mistake, Iranian people are chanting for democracy and equality, but not for the return of oppressive monarchy. Dear friends, the heart of the resistance in Iran is women, and we have among us the best of them, Madame Rajavi. Madame Rajavi, thank you for your leadership, perseverance, and audacity. Thank you for the hope you bring to the Iranian people every single day. Dear friends, Honorable Madame Rajavi, ladies and gentlemen, what is my takeaway from this year's summit? First, supporting the National Council of Resistance of Iran and CRI as the legitimate alternative to Iran's current regime. I strongly believe, I am convinced that is a paramount for several strategic and ethical reasons. And I think that political leaders in the last 2 days laid out those reasons very, very well and eloquently. Second, it is time for international community to stop giving the opportunities to leaders of the religious fascists of Iran in Tehran. It is time to stop policy of appeasement, and we need global support for free Iran now, and a renewed campaign against impunity of religious tyrants in Tehran. We need those new, renewed decision-making in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels, in every office on Capitol Hill, the European Parliament, the UN. Fight for Iran is our fight. In conclusion, I want to amplify Madame Rajavi's message in her opening remarks to all Iranians who are listening to us and are part of this impressive summit. You are the only ones who can and should change the clerical fascist tyranny in your country. It is critical time to step and unify your resistance. You are the only ones who can and should tear down the wall of isolation and oppression in Iran. Take the future of Iran into your own hands and show the whole world that the glory of free and prosperous Iran is within your reach. It's not only possible, but it's coming, and it's coming soon. God bless you and thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored now to introduce to you our next speaker, Stanislav Pavlovsky, the esteemed former Minister of Justice of Moldova and a distinguished former judge at the European Court of Human Rights.
استانیسلاو پاولوفچی، قاضی دادگاه حقوق بشر اروپا 2001 تا 2008. رژیم ایران علاقه‌ای به حاکمیت قانون ندارد، بلکه تلاش می‌کند از قانون سوء استفاده کند تا سرکوب خود را به مخالفان مقیم خارج از کشور گسترش دهد.
Ladies and gentlemen, Madame Rajavi, distinguished guests, being a former judge of the European Court of Human Rights, of course it is more usual for me to discuss legal and human rights issues. From this perspective, the current situation in Iran undoubtedly raises serious concern. The Islamic Republic of Iran's strict limitations on human rights deteriorated in various aspects through the year 2023. Women continued to face discrimination. At least 834 citizens were executed during the year, according to the United Nations. The judiciary and the court system are far from being objective. International observers criticized the lack of independence and impartiality of the country's judicial system and maintained that trials did not adhere to international standards of fairness. No wonder that the previous head of the judiciary, Ibrahim Raisi, was a member of the Death Commission in Tehran during the 1988 massacre of thousands of political prisoners, as was Mustafa Pourmohammadi, who was the Minister of Justice under the so-called moderate President Hassan Rouhani. Human rights activists reported trials in which authorities appeared to have determined the verdicts in advance, and the defendants did not have the opportunity to confront their accusers or meet with lawyers. For journalists and defendants charged with crimes against national security, law restricted the choice of attorneys to a government-appointed list. Human rights groups and international media noted the absence of procedural safeguards in criminal trials. The courts routinely admitted as evidence confessions made under duress and torture. Often these forced confessions were broadcast on state television. Last summer, the regime began a sham trial for 104 members of the Iranian democratic opposition who live mainly in Europe, especially in Albania. The judge began the first court session by saying that we are going to try these 104 terrorists, effectively passing judgment on them before the start of the trial. Furthermore, the regime has rejected a request by European and international lawyers who had requested to go to Iran to defend these dissidents. The judge and numerous other Iranian officials have repeatedly told the state media that the intention behind the trial is to obtain Interpol red notices against these 104 dissidents and have them extradited to Iran. As a former international judge, I know very well that any legitimate trial would require a presumption of innocence and the free access to lawyers. But it is clear that the regime is not interested in the rule of law. Rather, it is trying to misuse the law to extend its crackdown to its opponents living abroad. I urge all the European governments and legal and security apparatuses to reject any extradition requests from Iran that are a result of this sham trial. Of course, the abuses committed by the regime against the Iranian people are very serious and extensive. The list of these abuses is very long, but the ones I have just described are the most dangerous and require an immediate reaction from the international community. Let me say also that we are living in the 21st century. Each and every person is entitled to live in dignity, in freedom, and prosperity. And I think that the time has come for Iranian people to demand its rights. And you are entitled to ask your state to be returned back to you, and you to be entitled to organize your way of life in the way you wish to have it, in order to live in dignity, in freedom, and prosperity. Thank you very much.
ژنرال چاکوالد جانشین فرمانده نیروهای آمریکا در اروپا 2006. اقدامات رژیم ایران منبع اصلی بی‌ثباتی منطقه‌ای است. جامعه بین‌المللی باید سیاست جامعی اتخاذ کند که به رسمیت شناختن مقاومت و جایگزین دموکراتیک شورای ملی مقاومت را شامل می شود. طرح 10 ماده‌ای خانم مریم رجوی نقشه راهی الهام بخش برای آینده ایران ارائه می دهد. طرحی که تمام اشکال دیکتاتوری چه سلطنتی و چه مذهبی را رد می کند و از جمهوری مبتنی بر رأی همگانی، برابری جنسیتی و جدایی دین از دولت حمایت می کند. سرنوشت ایران و ثبات کل خاورمیانه در دست مردم آن به ویژه مقاومت سازمان یافته است که هر روز خستگی ناپذیر می جنگد.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you to address the grave challenges posed by the Iranian regime, not just to its own people, but to global peace and security. Iran's regime continues to destabilize the Middle East through a series of calculated actions that defy international norm and principle. This includes taking foreign nationals hostage only to use them as bargaining chips in exchange for its operatives arrested and convicted abroad on charges of terrorism and mass murder. Consider the case of Asadollah Assadi in Belgium, who was convicted and sentenced to 20 years for attempting to bomb the National Council of Resistance of Iran's annual summit in Paris in 2018. Many of you and I were present at that seminar. Then there was Hamid Nouri in Sweden, convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for his direct involvement in the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, the majority of whom were members of Mujahideen al-Khalq, the MEK. These actions are stark indicators of a regime that operates without regard for human life or international law. Both were released in shameful deals in exchange for Belgian and Swedish nationals held hostage by the regime. Given these stark realities, the call for regime change is not just necessary, it is urgent. This regime's record of suppression, its exploitation of terror, and its blatant disregard for human rights leaves us with no other choice. The world saw that in 1999, 2009, 2017, 2019, and 2022, how the Iranian regime crushed people's protests for change. This is why the people of Iran have reached the conclusions that the only way forward is an all-out organized resistance against this brutal regime, because this regime has shut all other avenues for change. This organized resistance movement made up of brave men and women who operate throughout Iran must be recognized and supported. Self-sufficient, these resistance units are ordinary Iranians who are putting their lives at risk to liberate Iran. They are not insurgents, they are freedom fighters, striving for a democratic, secular, and peaceful Iran. Our support must be robust, providing not only the moral backing, but also the political recognition. It is also essential to highlight the regime's destructive role across the Middle East. By supporting proxies in the region, Iran fuels ongoing conflicts and undermines efforts to restore peace. Iranian regime's actions are the main source for regional instability. The international community must do more than observe. A comprehensive policy with recognition of the resistance and democratic alternatives of the National Council of Resistance is long overdue. Mrs. Maryam Rajavi's 10-point plan offers a visionary roadmap for Iran's future, one that rejects all forms of dictatorship, both monarchic and religious, advocating for a republic based on universal suffrage, gender equality, and the separation of religion and state. This plan also emphasizes human rights a market economy, and a non-nuclear Iran, principles that align with global norms of governance and peaceful coexistence. Let us remember that the fate of Iran, and potentially the stability of the entire Middle East, rests in the hands of its people, particularly the organized resistance that fights tirelessly every day. Western democracies, my country and Europe alike, must abandon appeasement which has failed to moderate the behavior of this regime in the past 4 decades. Instead, we must support these agents of change, ensuring they have the resources and recognition needed to replace this oppressive regime with a government that respects the rights of its people and the norms of international community. Thank you.